There's something quietly fascinating about the ancient world. Not just the monuments or the myths, but the lingering sense that we are looking at only part of the picture. When you slow down and really examine the fragments left behind, stone structures, worn inscriptions, stories passed down through generations, you begin to notice a pattern. Not a clear answer, but a pattern of gaps, of missing pieces. And tonight, as you settle in, we're going to explore those gaps together, carefully, calmly, and without rushing to conclusions. Before we go any deeper, take a moment to get comfortable. And if you enjoy this kind of slow, thoughtful exploration, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you might think. Also, I'm always curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? Different places, different perspectives, and maybe different interpretations of the same ancient mysteries. Now, when we talk about ancient secrets, it's easy to imagine something hidden deliberately, lost knowledge, buried truths, forgotten technologies. But the reality, at least from a mainstream perspective, is often more grounded. Historians and archaeologists generally explain ancient civilizations through a combination of gradual development, environmental adaptation, and cultural evolution. Over thousands of years, humans learned to farm, to build, to organize societies. Structures like pyramids, temples, and cities are seen as the natural outcome of that long progression. Step by step, generation by generation. And yet, when you look closer, there are moments where that explanation feels incomplete. Not wrong, necessarily, but perhaps not the full story either. Take, for example, the precision of certain ancient structures. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to ingenuity, trial and error, and a deep understanding of available materials. Skilled workers, guided by experience and simple tools, achieving remarkable results over time. That makes sense, and there is plenty of evidence supporting it. But then you encounter specific cases, massive stone blocks fitted together so tightly that even modern tools struggle to replicate the same level of precision. Cuts that appear unusually smooth, alignments that seem almost too exact. So the question becomes, not was it possible, because clearly it was, but rather, how exactly was it done? What methods were used? What knowledge was passed down that we may no longer fully understand? And this is where things start to get interesting. Because across different ancient cultures, many of which had no known contact with each other, you begin to see similar patterns emerge. Monumental architecture, astronomical alignments, mythologies that reference beings or events connected to the sky. The mainstream explanation here is convergent development, different societies facing similar challenges, arriving at similar solutions. Humans everywhere look up at the stars. Humans everywhere seek meaning, structure, and order. But still, the similarities can feel striking. Consider how many ancient structures are aligned with celestial events. The solstices, the equinoxes, specific star constellations. The accepted view is that early civilizations were keen observers of the sky. They depended on it for agriculture, navigation, and timekeeping. Over generations, they developed sophisticated systems to track these cycles. That's entirely reasonable. In fact, it's impressive. But then you might wonder, how precise were their observations really? How did they maintain that precision over long periods without modern instruments? And why was this knowledge often embedded into massive, labor-intensive structures rather than simpler, more flexible systems? It raises an interesting possibility. Not that ancient people had advanced technology in the way we think of it today, but that they may have had different ways of understanding and interacting with their environment. Ways that we don't fully recognize anymore, because they don't fit neatly into our current frameworks. And then there are the stories. Ancient texts and oral traditions are often treated as mythology, symbolic narratives meant to explain natural phenomena or cultural values. And in many cases, that interpretation holds up well. Flood myths, for instance, appear in cultures all over the world. The mainstream explanation is that these stories are based on real, localized flooding events, remembered and retold over generations, gradually becoming more dramatic. But what's intriguing is how similar some of these stories are, even across vast distances. Not identical, but similar enough to make you pause. Could this be coincidence? Shared human psychology? Or is it possible that some of these stories are echoing events that were more widespread than we currently assume? Again, not jumping to conclusions, just asking the question. Another layer to this is the timeline. According to conventional history, complex civilization, cities, writing, large-scale architecture, really begins around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Before that, humans are generally seen as hunter-gatherers or early agricultural communities. That timeline is based on a significant amount of evidence, and it forms the backbone of modern archaeology. But in recent decades, discoveries have started to challenge parts of that timeline. Sites have been uncovered that appear to be far older than previously expected, yet show signs of organized construction and social coordination. The mainstream response is to adjust the timeline slightly to incorporate these new findings. That's how science works: refining, updating, improving. Still, each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. And sometimes, the puzzle seems to be getting more complex, not less. So where does that leave us? Some people look at these gaps and immediately jump to bold conclusions: lost civilizations with advanced technology, external influences, hidden knowledge deliberately erased. But the problem with jumping too quickly is that it replaces one unknown with another, often without enough evidence to support it. On the other hand, completely ignoring the gaps doesn't feel quite right either. Maybe the most honest position is somewhere in between, acknowledging what we know, recognizing what we don't, and staying open to the possibility that the past may be more nuanced than our current models suggest. Because if there's one consistent pattern in the study of history, it's that our understanding evolves. What seemed certain a century ago can look very different today, and what feels uncertain now may one day become clearer, or perhaps it will lead to even deeper questions. As you let that idea settle in, consider this: ancient secrets aren't always about hidden objects or forbidden knowledge. Sometimes they're simply about perspective, about looking at familiar things in a slightly different way, asking quieter questions, noticing details that are easy to overlook, and maybe, just maybe, realizing that the line between what we understand and what we don't is thinner than it seems. As that thought lingers, there's a natural tendency to move from the abstract into something more tangible, to anchor these ideas in places that still exist, places you can point to on a map or even stand in front of. Because while theories and interpretations can shift over time, the physical remnants of the ancient world remain, silent, unmoving, and in many ways, still unanswered. One of the most commonly referenced examples is the Great Pyramid of Giza. From a mainstream perspective, its purpose is relatively clear. It is understood as a tomb built during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu around 4,500 years ago. Archaeological evidence, such as inscriptions, nearby worker settlements, and burial practices consistent with other pyramids, supports this explanation. It fits within a broader cultural and historical framework of ancient Egypt, where monumental structures were often tied to religious beliefs about the afterlife. And yet, when you examine the pyramid more closely, certain aspects invite deeper reflection. Not contradiction, necessarily, but curiosity. The sheer scale of the structure is one thing. Originally standing at about 146 meters tall, composed of millions of stone blocks, some weighing several tons, it represents an enormous logistical effort. The mainstream explanation attributes this to a large organized workforce, likely composed of skilled laborers rather than slaves, working over decades with tools made primarily of copper and stone. Ramps, levers, and coordinated effort are thought to have been the key. That explanation is widely accepted, but it doesn't fully describe the precision. The alignment of the pyramid is remarkably accurate. Its sides oriented almost perfectly to the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. Today, we can achieve that kind of alignment using advanced instruments, satellite data, and digital measurements. In the ancient world, the assumption is that careful observation of the stars, particularly circumpolar stars, allowed for this level of accuracy. Over time, through repeated observation and refinement, they achieved what we now see. But here's where the question quietly emerges. How consistent were those observations? And how did they translate that celestial knowledge into physical construction on such a massive scale, without deviation? It's not that it's impossible, it's that the margin for error seems incredibly small. Then there's the internal structure. Narrow passageways, chambers placed with specific spatial relationships, and what appears to be intentional design beyond simple burial functionality. The so-called King's Chamber, for example, is constructed with massive granite blocks, some transported from quarries hundreds of kilometers away. Above it are relieving chambers, stacked layers of stone designed to distribute weight and prevent collapse. From an engineering standpoint, this shows a clear understanding of structural stress and load distribution. Again, mainstream archaeology acknowledges this as the result of accumulated knowledge and practical experience. Over generations, builders learned what worked and what didn't. But it raises another quiet question. How much trial and error would be required to reach that level of understanding? And where are the intermediate stages, the failed attempts, the experimental structures that show the learning process? Some exist, of course. There are earlier pyramids, like the bent pyramid, which shows a visible change in angle during construction, likely due to structural concerns. That's often cited as evidence of experimentation and adaptation, a learning curve captured in stone. And yet, the leap from those earlier forms to the precision of the Great Pyramid still feels significant. Now, to be clear, none of this disproves the mainstream explanation, but it does highlight areas where our understanding may still be incomplete. And when multiple incomplete areas begin to overlap, they create a kind of conceptual space, a space where alternative interpretations tend to emerge. Some suggest that structures like the Great Pyramid may have served additional purposes beyond burial, perhaps symbolic, astronomical, or even functional in ways we don't yet fully grasp. Others propose that ancient knowledge systems were more advanced than we currently recognize, not necessarily in terms of technology, but in terms of applied mathematics, geometry, and environmental awareness. These ideas exist on a spectrum. Some are grounded and cautious, others extend into more speculative territory. But at their core, they often begin with the same observation, that certain aspects of ancient structures invite further questioning. And the Great Pyramid is not alone in this. Across the world, there are sites that echo similar themes: massive stones, precise alignments, and construction techniques that challenge simple explanations. In Peru, for example, the fortress of Sacsayhuaman features enormous stone blocks fitted together with such precision that even a thin blade cannot pass between them. The stones are irregular in shape, yet they interlock perfectly, forming walls that have withstood centuries of earthquakes. Mainstream archaeology explains this through skilled stone shaping and an understanding of seismic stability. The irregular shapes actually help distribute stress during earthquakes, allowing the structure to flex rather than crack. It's a brilliant solution, one that reflects deep practical knowledge of the environment. But again, the question gently returns. How was that knowledge developed? And how was it applied so consistently across such large structures? Similarly, in Lebanon, the site of Baalbek contains some of the largest stone blocks ever used in construction. The trilithon stones, each weighing hundreds of tons, are positioned with remarkable accuracy. The mainstream view attributes this to Roman engineering, known for its sophistication and scale. Yet even within that framework, the logistics remain staggering. Transporting and placing stones of that size would require coordination, planning, and techniques that are still debated today. So what we begin to see is not a single mystery, but a pattern of them. Different cultures, different time periods, different environments, and yet similar questions emerging again and again. Not contradictions, not impossibilities, just gaps. And perhaps that's what makes these ancient secrets so compelling. Not because they point to a single hidden truth waiting to be uncovered, but because they remind us that history is not a finished story. It's an ongoing process of discovery, interpretation, and revision. As you let your mind wander through these ancient places, stone corridors, towering walls, carefully aligned structures, there's a quiet realization that begins to take shape. That the past is not as distant as it seems. That the people who built these things were not so different from us. And yet, in some ways, they may have understood aspects of the world that we are only beginning to rediscover. And maybe the real question isn't just how they built these structures, but why they chose to build them in the ways that they did. Because intention leaves traces, patterns, choices that reflect not just capability, but purpose. And if we follow those patterns carefully, without rushing, without forcing conclusions, we might begin to see something just beneath the surface. Something subtle, but persistent. A quiet signal, hidden in plain sight. And if there is a signal, something subtle, something woven quietly into the choices ancient civilizations made, then one of the most revealing places to look is not just in the structures themselves, but in where they were placed and how they relate to the wider landscape around them. Because location, especially in the ancient world, was rarely accidental. It was chosen, observed, and often revisited over generations. From a mainstream perspective, the placement of ancient sites is usually explained through practical needs. Access to water, fertile land for agriculture, defensible positions, and proximity to trade routes all played a major role in where early settlements emerged. This makes perfect sense. Survival comes first, and civilizations grow outward from what is sustainable. Rivers like the Nile, the Tigris, and the Indus became lifelines, shaping entire cultures around their predictable rhythms. But when we step back and look at certain ancient sites on a larger scale, not just individually, but in relation to each other, another layer begins to emerge. Not a contradiction to practicality, but something that seems to sit alongside it. Take, for instance, the recurring presence of ancient structures along specific latitudes or aligned with particular geographical features. One of the most frequently discussed examples is the Giza Plateau, where the pyramids, including the Great Pyramid, are located. Beyond its local significance, some have noted that it sits close to a line of latitude that, when measured in modern terms, corresponds closely to the center of the Earth's landmass distribution. Now, to be clear, this observation is often debated. The idea of a center of landmass depends on how it is calculated, and whether such a concept would have had any meaning in the ancient world. Mainstream archaeology does not consider this alignment to be intentional, largely because there is no direct evidence that ancient Egyptians had a global understanding of geography in that sense. And yet, the observation exists, and it raises a quiet question. Not necessarily that the placement was intentional on a global scale, but that there may be patterns in location that we don't fully understand yet, simply because we're looking at them through a modern lens. This becomes even more intriguing when we consider other sites around the world that seem to share unusual positional relationships. In Mexico, the ancient city of Teotihuacan is laid out with a level of geometric planning that suggests careful measurement and intentional orientation. The Avenue of the Dead, its main axis, is offset slightly from true north, and the reason for this offset is still discussed. Some researchers suggest it aligns with certain celestial events or topographical features. Again, the mainstream explanation leans toward local factors, perhaps alignment with nearby mountains, or astronomical observations tied to specific dates important to the culture. But the precision of the layout invites further curiosity. Why this exact angle? Why this specific orientation, repeated across multiple structures within the city? And then there's Stonehenge in United Kingdom. One of the most studied ancient sites in the world, it is widely accepted that Stonehenge has astronomical alignments, particularly with the solstices. The positioning of the stones allows sunlight to pass through specific points during sunrise and sunset on key days of the year. The mainstream view is that this reflects a deep cultural and agricultural connection to seasonal cycles. Knowing when the solstices occur would have been essential for planning planting and harvesting. The monument, therefore, serves as a kind of calendar, one that is both functional and ceremonial. But even within that explanation, there's room for reflection, because building something like Stonehenge requires significant effort, coordination, and time. The stones themselves were transported from considerable distances, some from over 200 kilometers away. So the question becomes, why invest so much energy into marking these celestial events in such a permanent, monumental way? Was it purely practical? Or was there something more symbolic, perhaps even philosophical, about anchoring time itself into the landscape? And when we begin to connect these sites, not in the sense of direct communication or shared planning, but in terms of recurring themes, we start to notice something subtle, a pattern of orientation, a relationship between earth and sky, a tendency to encode information not just in stories or symbols, but in physical space. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges this to an extent. The field of archaeoastronomy, for example, studies how ancient cultures understood and utilized the sky in their constructions. It's a well-established area of research, grounded in evidence and careful analysis. But like many areas of study, it also has its limits. It can tell us what is aligned and sometimes how those alignments work. But the deeper question, why those specific alignments mattered so much, is often more difficult to answer with certainty. And this is where interpretation begins to branch out. Some suggest that ancient civilizations may have shared a more unified worldview than we currently assume. A worldview in which the sky, the earth, and human life were deeply interconnected. Not in a mystical sense necessarily, but in a practical, observational one. The movements of celestial bodies were not abstract concepts. They were directly tied to survival, navigation, and the passage of time. Others take that idea a step further, asking whether there could have been forms of knowledge, systems of understanding that were once widespread but are now fragmented. Not lost in a dramatic sense, but gradually eroded over time as cultures changed, languages evolved, and priorities shifted. Again, these are questions, not conclusions, because it's important to remain grounded, to recognize that patterns can sometimes emerge simply because we are looking for them. The human mind is incredibly good at connecting dots, even when those connections may not have been intentional. And yet, not all patterns are accidental. So perhaps the most balanced approach is to hold both possibilities at once, to acknowledge the strength of mainstream explanations, the evidence, the consistency, the logical frameworks, while also allowing space for curiosity, for the idea that there may be layers we haven't fully uncovered yet. As you imagine these ancient places, not just as isolated landmarks, but as part of a wider, interconnected landscape, you might begin to feel a shift in perspective. The past becomes less about distant events and more about a kind of dialogue, a conversation across time, carried through stone, alignment, and intention. And maybe, just maybe, the real secret isn't hidden in any single site, but in the relationships between them, in the quiet patterns that only begin to emerge when you stop looking for answers and start simply observing. And as that idea begins to settle in, that perhaps the deeper story of the ancient world is not found in isolated discoveries, but in patterns and relationships, the next step is to look even closer. Not just at where these structures are placed, but at how they are built. Because materials, methods, and construction techniques carry their own kind of quiet evidence. Evidence that doesn't speak in words, but in surfaces, angles, and the marks left behind by tools that may or may not still exist. From a mainstream perspective, ancient construction techniques are the result of gradual refinement. Early humans began with simple tools, stone hammers, wooden levers, and over time developed more advanced methods using copper, bronze, and eventually iron. Through repetition, experimentation, and the passing down of knowledge, they became increasingly skilled at shaping materials like limestone, granite, and basalt. This process, stretched across generations, is what allowed for the creation of increasingly complex structures, and in many cases, this explanation fits well with the evidence we have. Tool marks found on stones often match what we would expect from the materials available at the time. Quarries have been discovered with partially cut blocks, showing clear signs of how stone was extracted. There are even ancient depictions, carvings and paintings that illustrate workers transporting and shaping stone using ropes, sledges, and coordinated labor. But then, there are moments where the physical evidence invites a second look. Consider the surfaces of certain stone blocks found in multiple ancient sites around the world. In some cases, the cuts appear unusually smooth, almost polished. In others, there are drill holes or grooves that seem remarkably consistent in depth and diameter, suggesting a level of control that feels very precise. Mainstream archaeology explains this through techniques such as abrasive cutting, where sand and other materials are used alongside tools to gradually wear down stone surfaces. Over time, with enough effort, even very hard materials can be shaped with surprising accuracy. That makes sense. It aligns with known principles of physics and material science. But the question that quietly follows is one of efficiency. How long would such processes take? And how were they applied so consistently across large numbers of stones, often in remote or challenging environments? Again, not impossible, just intriguing. In places like Sacsayhuaman, the stones are not only massive, but intricately shaped to fit together without mortar. Each block is unique, with multiple samperk points, multiple contact points that interlock with neighboring stones in a way that distributes weight and resists seismic activity. The mainstream explanation emphasizes skilled craftsmanship, careful planning, and iterative shaping, placing a stone, adjusting it, removing it, reshaping it, and repeating the process until the fit is exact. It's a labor-intensive method, but a logical one, and it demonstrates a deep understanding of both materials and environmental conditions. But then you might pause and consider, how was this level of craftsmanship taught and maintained? What kind of training would be required to achieve such precision? And how was that knowledge preserved across generations without written manuals or standardized measurements as we understand them today? And then there are sites where the stones themselves seem to challenge expectations in a different way, not through their shape, but through their size. At Baalbek, for example, the foundation stones include blocks that weigh hundreds, even over 1,000 tons. The mainstream view attributes this to Roman engineering, which was indeed capable of remarkable feats. Systems of rollers, cranes, and manpower could, in theory, move extremely heavy objects. But the scale here pushes the limits of what is typically documented. Not beyond possibility, but certainly into the upper range of what would have been achievable. And when you consider not just moving these stones, but placing them with precision, aligning them within a larger structure, it adds another layer of complexity. So once again, we find ourselves in that familiar space. A space where the mainstream explanation is plausible, supported, and grounded, but where the details invite further thought. And perhaps that's the key word here: details. Because when you zoom out, everything can seem straightforward. Civilizations grow, they build, they improve over time. But when you zoom in, when you look closely at the marks on a single stone, the angle of a single cut, the way two surfaces meet, you begin to see the subtlety, the care, the decisions that were made moment by moment by people whose names we may never know. And it's in those details that questions tend to live. Some researchers have explored the idea that ancient builders may have used techniques that are not immediately obvious to us today. Not necessarily advanced in a modern technological sense, but different. Perhaps involving methods of measurement, material treatment, or even environmental manipulation that were effective within their specific context, but don't translate easily into our current frameworks. Others suggest that we may be underestimating the capabilities of ancient societies, not because they had access to unknown technologies, but because we tend to view the past through a lens of linear progress. The assumption that earlier means simpler and later means more advanced. But history doesn't always move in a straight line. Knowledge can be gained, lost, rediscovered, and reinterpreted. And if that's the case, then it's possible that some techniques were once well understood, widely practiced, and then gradually faded from use, leaving behind only the results, not the process. But again, it's important to stay grounded, to recognize that extraordinary claims require strong evidence, and that speculation, while valuable, must be handled carefully. The goal is not to replace one mystery with another, but to explore the edges of what we know, and to remain open to the possibility that those edges may shift over time. As you picture these ancient builders, not as distant figures in a textbook, but as real people, working with intention, solving problems, adapting to challenges, you begin to sense something else, something quieter, but perhaps more profound. That the true sophistication of these structures may not lie in any single technique, but in the combination of many. Observation, experience, collaboration, and time, layered together in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct. And maybe that's part of the reason these ancient secrets continue to resonate. Not because they defy explanation, but because they resist simplification. They remind us that understanding the past is not just about finding answers, but about asking better questions. And as those questions begin to take shape, slowly, carefully, they start to point in a new direction, not just toward how these structures were built or where they were placed, but towards something even more abstract, something that exists not in stone or soil, but in the way ancient people understood reality itself. And as the focus begins to shift, from physical structures and construction techniques towards something more abstract, we find ourselves entering a different kind of territory, not one defined by stone and measurement, but by perception. Because beyond the monuments and materials, every ancient civilization was guided by a worldview, a way of interpreting reality, time, and existence itself. And it's within these worldviews that some of the most subtle and intriguing patterns begin to emerge. From a mainstream perspective, ancient belief systems are understood as early attempts to explain the natural world. Without modern science, people turn to observation, storytelling, and symbolic thinking to make sense of what they experienced. The movement of the sun, the changing seasons, the unpredictability of weather, these were not just environmental factors, but forces that shape daily life. Over time, these observations became embedded in mythologies, religions, and cultural practices. This framework is well supported. We can trace the evolution of belief systems through written records, oral traditions, and archaeological findings. Symbols repeat, deities take form, and narratives develop around cycles of life, death, and renewal. It's a process that reflects both creativity and necessity, a way of bringing order to an unpredictable world. But when we look more closely at these belief systems, not just individually, but across different cultures, something interesting begins to take shape. Not a single shared story, but a series of recurring themes. Themes that appear in civilizations separated by vast distances and, according to current understanding, with no direct contact. One of the most persistent of these themes is the idea of cycles. Not just seasonal cycles, which are easy to observe, but much larger patterns, ages of humanity, repeating eras, rises and declines of civilizations. In ancient India, for example, texts describe vast cycles of time known as yugas, each representing a different stage in a repeating sequence. In ancient Greece, there are references to ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, again suggesting a kind of cyclical progression. The mainstream interpretation sees these as symbolic frameworks, ways of expressing moral or philosophical ideas about human nature and societal change. And that interpretation holds weight. These stories often reflect concerns about decline, renewal, and the passage of time. But there's another layer to consider. Why cycles? Why did so many ancient cultures, independently, arrive at a model of time that is not linear, but repeating? Was it purely observational, based on the obvious cycles of day and night, seasons, and lunar phases? Or could it reflect a deeper pattern they believed existed on a larger scale? Again, not a conclusion, just a question. Another recurring theme is the connection between the heavens and the earth, not just in terms of physical alignment, but in terms of meaning. The sky was not simply a backdrop, it was a reference point, a source of order. Constellations were mapped, tracked, and often associated with stories or deities. The movements of planets were observed with remarkable consistency, long before the invention of telescopes. Mainstream archaeology and the history of science recognize this as early astronomy. Ancient people were careful observers, and over time, they developed systems to predict celestial events with surprising accuracy. These systems were often tied to calendars, rituals, and agricultural planning. But what's intriguing is how this knowledge was integrated into culture, not separated from it. In many ancient societies, there wasn't a clear distinction between science, religion, and daily life. Observing the sky was not just a technical activity, it was a meaningful one. It carried symbolic weight. It informed decisions, shaped architecture, and influenced how people understood their place in the world. And this leads to another quiet question. Did ancient civilizations see patterns in the sky that we no longer recognize? Not because they aren't there, but because we interpret them differently. Our modern approach tends to separate disciplines. Astronomy is a science. Mythology is a cultural artifact. Architecture is engineering. But in the ancient world, these categories often overlapped. A structure could be both a functional space and a symbolic representation. A story could encode both moral lessons and observational knowledge. So when we encounter ancient texts or symbols that seem abstract or metaphorical, it's worth considering whether they might also contain layers of practical information encoded in a way that made sense within that cultural context. Some researchers have explored the idea that myths may preserve fragments of real events, natural disasters, astronomical occurrences, environmental changes, retold through symbolic language. The mainstream view is cautious here, emphasizing that while some myths may be inspired by real events, they are not reliable historical records in the modern sense. And that caution is important. But it doesn't mean the stories are without value. It simply means they need to be interpreted carefully, with attention to both their symbolic and contextual meaning. And perhaps that's where the real complexity lies, not in choosing between literal and symbolic interpretations, but in recognizing that both may be present at the same time. As you reflect on these ancient worldviews, there's a subtle shift that begins to occur. The past starts to feel less like a distant, disconnected era, and more like a different way of seeing, a different lens through which reality was understood. Not necessarily better or worse, just different. And within that difference, there may be insights that are easy to overlook if we only approach the past with modern assumptions. Insights about patterns, relationships, and the interconnectedness of systems, both natural and human. Because if ancient civilizations were observing cycles, tracking the sky, and embedding that knowledge into their environments and stories, then perhaps their understanding of the world was not just about survival, but about coherence, about finding a sense of order in complexity. And maybe that's one of the quiet threads that runs through many of these ancient secrets. Not a hidden technology or a lost civilization, but a way of thinking, a way of perceiving patterns that we are still trying to fully understand. As that idea settles in, it naturally leads to another question. If ancient people saw the world in terms of patterns and cycles, then how did they measure those patterns? How did they keep track of time, not just in days or seasons, but across longer spans? Because time, after all, is one of the most fundamental ways we organize reality. And the way it was understood in the ancient world may hold more depth than it first appears. And when we begin to follow that question, how ancient civilizations understood and measured time, something quietly remarkable starts to emerge. Because time, unlike stone or landscape, leaves no direct trace. It cannot be excavated or physically examined. And yet, its presence is everywhere in the ancient world, encoded in structures, embedded in rituals, and reflected in systems that were clearly designed with long-term observation in mind. From a mainstream perspective, the development of timekeeping is closely tied to necessity. Early humans needed to track cycles, day and night, the phases of the moon, the changing seasons, in order to survive. Agriculture depends on timing. Navigation depends on timing. Even social organization, over time, becomes linked to shared systems of measuring and recording duration. The earliest calendars were based on direct observation. The lunar cycle, for example, is one of the most obvious patterns in the sky. Roughly every 29.5 days, the moon completes its phases, providing a natural rhythm that could be tracked without instruments. Many ancient cultures built their calendars around this cycle, dividing time into months that aligned with the moon's progression. This is well understood and widely accepted. But as societies grew more complex, so did their need for precision. Lunar calendars alone are not perfectly aligned with the solar year, the time it takes for the Earth to complete one orbit around the Sun. Over time, this mismatch creates drift, causing seasonal markers to shift unless adjustments are made. And this is where ancient timekeeping becomes more intricate. In ancient Egypt, for instance, the calendar was based on the solar year, divided into 365 days. This system was closely tied to the annual flooding of the Nile, a critical event for agriculture. The rising of a particular star, Sirius, just before sunrise, was used as a marker to predict this flooding. This event, known as the heliacal rising, occurs at a specific time each year and would have been a reliable signal for seasonal change. Mainstream archaeology views this as a sophisticated but logical development. Careful observation over long periods allowed ancient Egyptians to correlate celestial events with environmental patterns. Over generations, this knowledge was refined into a working calendar system. But again, there's a layer beneath the surface that invites a closer look. Because tracking something like the heliacal rising of a star requires consistency. It requires long-term observation, accurate record keeping, and a stable method of transmitting that knowledge across generations. Even small errors, if repeated over time, could lead to significant discrepancies. So the question becomes, how did ancient civilizations maintain that level of consistency, especially over centuries? And then there's the matter of scale. Some ancient structures appear to reflect not just annual cycles, but much longer ones. Cycles that extend beyond a single lifetime, beyond even a few generations. One example often discussed is the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in the Earth's rotational axis that causes the position of stars to shift gradually over a period of approximately 26,000 years. From a mainstream standpoint, there is debate about how much ancient civilizations understood this phenomenon. While some later cultures, such as the Greeks, are known to have identified aspects of precession, it's less clear whether earlier societies had a precise understanding of it. There is no definitive evidence that ancient builders were intentionally encoding this cycle into their structures. And yet, some researchers have pointed out alignments and symbolic references that seem to correspond, at least loosely, with long-term astronomical changes. These interpretations are often controversial, and they require careful scrutiny. It's easy to project modern knowledge onto ancient contexts, but the idea itself is interesting. Not necessarily that ancient people had a full scientific model of precession, but that they may have noticed gradual shifts in the sky over long periods, subtle changes that, when observed across generations, begin to form a pattern. And if that's the case, then time, for them, may have been experienced not just as a sequence of days and years, but as a layered system of cycles, some short and immediate, others slow and almost imperceptible. This brings us back to those recurring themes, the cycles of ages, the rise and fall of civilizations, the sense that time itself may move in patterns rather than straight lines. From a modern perspective, time is often treated as linear, a continuous progression from past to present to future. But in many ancient cultures, time was understood as something more fluid, more repetitive, not necessarily repeating in an exact way, but moving through phases, patterns that echo rather than duplicate. And this perspective can change how we interpret ancient structures and systems. A calendar, for example, is not just a tool for tracking days. It's a model of how a culture understands time, what it chooses to measure, what it chooses to emphasize, and how it connects those measurements to the world around it. In the case of ancient civilizations, those connections often extend beyond practicality. Timekeeping was not just about agriculture or navigation. It was also tied to ritual, identity, and meaning. Certain days were considered significant, not just because of their position in a cycle, but because of what they represented. And when time is given meaning, it becomes something more than a measurement. It becomes a framework for understanding existence itself. So when we look at ancient timekeeping systems, We're not just looking at early science, we're looking at a way of thinking, a way of organizing reality that integrates observation, symbolism, and experience. And perhaps that's why these systems continue to resonate, not because they hold hidden secrets in a literal sense, but because they reflect a perspective that is both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. We still track time, we still observe cycles, but the way we interpret those cycles has changed. And maybe, in that difference, there's something worth paying attention to. Because if ancient civilizations were capable of observing and maintaining complex systems of time over long periods, then it suggests a level of continuity, of stability that is easy to overlook. Knowledge that was not just discovered, but preserved, passed down, refined, and integrated into daily life in ways that we are still trying to fully understand. And as that realization begins to take shape, it opens the door to another question. If time was so carefully observed, so deeply integrated into ancient systems, then what role did it play in shaping their decisions, their constructions, their stories, their sense of purpose? Because measuring time is one thing, but living in alignment with it is something else entirely. And if time was not just measured, but lived, if it was something ancient civilizations aligned themselves with rather than simply tracked, then it begins to reshape how we interpret many of their choices. Because alignment, in this sense, is no longer just physical or astronomical. It becomes behavioral, cultural, even philosophical, a way of existing within patterns rather than outside of them. From a mainstream perspective, much of ancient life was structured around necessity. Agricultural cycles dictated daily routines. Seasonal changes influenced migration, trade, and food storage. Religious festivals often coincided with key points in the calendar, reinforcing social cohesion and shared identity. These patterns created stability, allowing societies to function and grow. This framework is well supported by historical and archaeological evidence. When survival depends on timing, planting at the right moment, harvesting before conditions change, it makes sense that timekeeping would become deeply embedded in daily life. Rituals, in this context, are not just symbolic. They serve as reminders, anchors that keep communities synchronized with the natural world. But when we look more closely, there are moments where this synchronization seems to go beyond practicality. Certain structures, for example, appear to have been built not just to mark time, but to interact with it in very specific ways. Light and shadow, for instance, are used with remarkable precision in some ancient sites. At particular times of the year, sunlight enters a chamber at a precise angle, illuminating a specific point within the structure. This is not random. It requires careful planning, an understanding of solar movement, and a commitment to maintaining that alignment over time. The mainstream explanation is that these features served ceremonial or symbolic purposes. They may have marked important dates, reinforced religious narratives, or provided a visual representation of cosmic order. And this interpretation fits well with what we know about ancient cultures, where symbolism and function often overlap. But again, there's a subtle question beneath the surface. Why express these moments in such a precise, physical way? Why not rely solely on observation or simpler markers? Why embed these alignments into stone, into architecture that requires significant effort to construct and maintain? One possibility is that these structures acted as a kind of interface, a way of connecting human experience with larger patterns. Not in a technological sense, but in a perceptual one. By creating spaces where time could be seen, felt, and experienced directly, ancient people may have been reinforcing their connection to cycles that were otherwise abstract. And if that's the case, then these structures are not just markers of time, but environments designed to shape awareness. This idea becomes even more interesting when we consider how consistent some of these design choices are across different cultures. In various parts of the world, we find structures that use light, shadow, orientation, and geometry to create specific effects at specific times. The details vary, of course, but the underlying principle remains similar, aligning human-made environments with natural cycles. Mainstream archaeology explains this through shared human observation. The sun rises and sets everywhere. The seasons change everywhere. It's natural that different cultures would develop ways to track and represent these patterns, and that explanation is strong. But it doesn't fully address the experiential aspect, the way these alignments are felt, not just observed. Imagine standing inside a structure where, once a year, at a precise moment, a beam of sunlight enters and illuminates a specific location. There's a sense of anticipation, of timing, of something aligning not just externally, but internally. It's a moment that connects observation with experience, and perhaps that's part of what these ancient systems were designed to do. Not just to measure time, but to create moments of alignment, moments where human awareness and natural cycles intersect in a tangible way. This brings us back to the idea of patterns, not just patterns that are seen, but patterns that are lived, patterns that shape behavior, perception, and meaning over time. Some researchers have explored the possibility that ancient cultures may have had a more integrated approach to knowledge, one where observation, ritual, and environment were not separate domains, but parts of a unified system. In this view, a structure is not just a building, a calendar is not just a tool, and a ritual is not just a tradition. They are all expressions of the same underlying framework. Others remain cautious, emphasizing that while these connections are interesting, they should not be overinterpreted. It's important to avoid projecting modern ideas onto ancient contexts, especially when the evidence is limited or ambiguous. And that caution is important, because the goal is not to create a new narrative, but to explore the edges of the existing one, to notice where things fit neatly and where they don't, to remain open but grounded. Still, the idea of alignment, of living in sync with patterns, continues to echo. Because even in our modern world, where time is measured with extreme precision, there's still a sense that something has shifted. Time is segmented, optimized, often disconnected from natural cycles. Days are divided into hours, minutes, seconds. But the connection to larger patterns can sometimes feel distant. And when we look back at ancient systems, there's a sense, subtle but persistent, that time was experienced differently. Not just as something to manage, but as something to participate in. And maybe that's one of the quieter insights hidden within these ancient secrets. Not a lost technology, not a hidden civilization, but a different relationship with time itself. As that thought begins to settle, it opens another direction. Because if ancient people were aligning themselves with cycles, if they were embedding those cycles into their environments and experiences, then it raises a deeper question. What did they believe those cycles represented? Not just physically, but symbolically. Because patterns, after all, can carry meaning, and the meanings assigned to those patterns can shape entire civilizations. And when we begin to follow that question, what ancient civilizations believed these patterns represented, we start to move into a deeper layer of interpretation. Because patterns on their own are neutral. The rising of the sun, the changing of seasons, the movement of stars. These are observable, repeatable, consistent. But meaning is something we assign. And once meaning is assigned to a pattern, it begins to shape how people think, act, and organize their world. From a mainstream perspective, Symbolism in ancient cultures developed as a way to communicate complex ideas in a memorable and transferable form. Before widespread literacy, stories and symbols were essential tools. They allowed knowledge to be preserved across generations, encoded in narratives that could be retold, adapted, and understood within a shared cultural context. This is why we see recurring symbols across ancient civilizations: circles representing cycles or completeness, serpents representing renewal or transformation, and celestial bodies often associated with deities or cosmic forces. These symbols are not random. They are rooted in observation, shaped by environment, and reinforced through tradition. And yet, when similar symbols appear across cultures that were geographically separated, it invites a closer look. Take the concept of a great cycle or a repeating age. As mentioned earlier, different civilizations describe time not as a straight line, but as a sequence of phases. In some traditions, these phases were associated with moral or spiritual qualities, periods of harmony followed by decline, then renewal. From a mainstream standpoint, this reflects human awareness of societal change. Civilizations rise and fall. Stability gives way to instability, and over time, patterns emerge. But there's another way to look at it, not as a literal cycle repeating identically, but as an attempt to model something more complex. A way of expressing that change itself follows patterns, even if those patterns are not perfectly predictable. And if that's the case, then these symbolic systems may have been more than just stories. They may have been frameworks, ways of organizing knowledge about the world, even if that knowledge was expressed metaphorically. This idea becomes even more interesting when we consider how symbols were often tied to physical spaces. Temples, monuments, and cities were not just functional. They were symbolic environments. The layout of a structure, the orientation of its walls, the placement of its chambers, all of these could carry meaning. From a mainstream archaeological perspective, this is understood as ritual architecture. Buildings designed to reflect cultural beliefs, to create spaces where certain experiences could occur. Ceremonies, gatherings, moments of transition. The symbolism reinforces the purpose of the space. But if we take a step back, there's a possibility that these symbolic environments were also a way of encoding knowledge. Not in the way we think of data storage today, but in a more experiential sense. A person moving through a space, observing its features, participating in its rituals, would be engaging with a system of meaning that is both physical and conceptual. And that raises a subtle but important question. How much of that meaning has been preserved and how much has been lost? Because symbols depend on context. Without understanding the framework they belong to, their meaning can shift, fade, or become fragmented. What once represented a specific idea or observation might now appear abstract or purely decorative. This is where interpretation becomes challenging. Modern researchers rely on available evidence, texts, artifacts, comparisons between cultures to reconstruct meaning. And in many cases, this approach is highly effective. We can translate languages, identify deities, understand rituals. But there are limits. Not everything was written down. Not every symbol was explained. And so, there are moments where we are left with the symbol, but not the full explanation. This doesn't mean the meaning is completely lost. It means it may be incomplete. And in that incompleteness, there is room for both careful analysis and thoughtful speculation. Some researchers suggest that certain symbols may reflect observations of natural or astronomical phenomena, encoded in a way that made them easier to remember and transmit. Others propose that symbols served multiple purposes at once: practical, spiritual, and educational, layered together in ways that are difficult to separate. Again, these are not definitive conclusions. They are possibilities, grounded in patterns that can be observed but not always fully explained. As you consider these symbolic systems, there's a quiet realization that begins to form. That ancient knowledge may not have been organized in the same way we organize knowledge today. Instead of separating disciplines, ancient cultures may have integrated them, combining observation, meaning, and experience into unified systems. And if that's true, then understanding those systems requires more than just analysis. It requires a shift in perspective, not abandoning logic or evidence, but expanding the way we interpret them. Because a symbol, after all, is not just an image, it's a connection between an idea and a form. And when that connection is repeated, reinforced, and embedded into a culture, it becomes a powerful tool for preserving knowledge, even if that knowledge is not immediately obvious. So perhaps the question is not just what these symbols meant, but how they were used, how they functioned within the broader system of a civilization, how they shaped behavior, guided decisions, and influenced the way people understood their place in the world. Because meaning, once established, tends to ripple outward. It affects architecture, storytelling, timekeeping, and even social structure. And when those elements begin to align, when patterns, symbols, and environments all reflect the same underlying ideas, you start to see something more cohesive, a system that is not random, but intentional, not necessarily mysterious, but layered. And as that idea begins to take shape, it naturally leads to another question. If ancient civilizations were encoding meaning into symbols, structures, and systems, then how much of that knowledge was local and how much of it was shared? Because similarities between cultures can arise in different ways, sometimes through independent development, and sometimes through connection. And that question, whether similarities between ancient civilizations arose independently or through some form of connection, is where the conversation begins to widen. Because once you start comparing cultures across distance and time, the patterns don't just stay within a single region. They begin to stretch outward, forming echoes that are difficult to ignore, but also difficult to fully explain. From a mainstream perspective, the similarities between ancient civilizations are largely attributed to what is known as parallel or convergent development. Different groups of people facing similar challenges, such as agriculture, climate, survival, and social organization, often arrive at similar solutions. Monumental architecture, for example, appears in many parts of the world because large structures serve clear purposes. They demonstrate power, unify populations, and create lasting cultural identity. This explanation is grounded, logical, and supported by a wide range of evidence. Human beings share cognitive patterns. We observe the same sky, respond to similar environmental pressures, and develop tools and systems that reflect those shared experiences. But when we begin to look more closely, certain similarities feel more specific than what we might expect from coincidence alone. For example, pyramidal structures appear in multiple regions, most famously in Egypt and Mexico. The mainstream explanation is that pyramids are simply one of the most stable ways to build tall structures using stone. A wide base and narrowing top distribute weight efficiently, making collapse less likely. Given that limitation, it's not surprising that different cultures would arrive at similar designs. And that makes sense. But then you might notice that these structures are not just similar in shape. They are often tied to similar symbolic meanings. They are associated with the heavens, with ascent, with connection between earth and sky. In both regions, pyramids are not just buildings, they are focal points of ritual, power, and cosmology. So the question becomes, are we seeing the same idea expressed in different places because it is an obvious conclusion? Or because there was some form of shared conceptual framework, whether direct or indirect? Another example lies in ancient flood narratives. Cultures across the world, Mesopotamian, Indian, Mesoamerican, and others, contain stories of great floods that reset or reshape the world. The mainstream view, again, points to localized flooding events. Rivers overflow. Coastal regions experience storms. Over time, these events are remembered, retold, and gradually become larger in scale within the narrative. This explanation is well supported, especially when we consider how memory and storytelling work. Stories evolve. Details become exaggerated. Separate events can merge into a single narrative over generations. But what's interesting is how consistent the core structure of these stories can be. A great flood, a warning, a survival mechanism, often involving a vessel or elevated refuge. And then, a rebuilding. It doesn't prove a single global event, but it does suggest that certain types of experiences, or at least certain ways of interpreting those experiences, are deeply embedded in human culture. And then there are linguistic and symbolic parallels. Certain motifs, like the world tree, the cosmic mountain, or the idea of a central axis connecting different realms, appear in multiple traditions. From a mainstream standpoint, these are archetypal symbols. They emerge from shared human psychology, from the way we conceptualize space, hierarchy, and connection. And again, that explanation is strong, but it leaves open a subtle possibility. Not that these cultures were directly connected in a way that modern communication would suggest, but that there may have been periods of interaction, exchange, or shared ancestry that are not yet fully understood. Because history, as we know it, is incomplete. Not in a dramatic or conspiratorial sense, but in a practical one. Evidence degrades, records are lost, entire regions remain unexplored or only partially studied. What we have is a fragment, a carefully assembled fragment, but a fragment nonetheless. So when we encounter similarities, we have to hold multiple possibilities at once. Independent development, limited contact, shared origins. Each has its place, and each must be evaluated based on evidence. But perhaps the most interesting part of this discussion is not which explanation is correct, but what the similarities themselves reveal. They suggest that ancient civilizations, despite their differences, were asking similar questions. Where do we come from? What governs the world around us? What patterns can we rely on? And how do we position ourselves within those patterns? These are not simple questions. And the fact that they appear across cultures suggests that they are deeply human. So maybe the similarities we see are not just about structures or stories, but about perspective. About the ways in which human beings, regardless of time or place, try to make sense of complexity. And if that's the case, then the ancient world is not just a collection of separate civilizations, but a kind of distributed exploration. Different groups, in different environments, observing, interpreting, and encoding their understanding in ways that sometimes overlap. Not because they were all connected in a single network, but because they were all connected to the same reality, the same sky, the same cycles, the same fundamental questions. And as that idea begins to settle, it leads us gently toward another layer of inquiry. Because if ancient civilizations were observing the same world, asking similar questions, and sometimes arriving at similar answers, then what happened to that continuity? Why do so many of these systems, these patterns of thought, these integrated ways of understanding, appear to fade, fragment, or transform over time? Because civilizations don't just emerge, they change, they adapt, and sometimes they disappear. And in that process, knowledge can shift or be lost, not suddenly, but gradually. Which brings us to the next question. What happens to knowledge when a civilization declines? And more importantly, how much of it can truly be recovered? And when we begin to follow that question, What happens to knowledge when a civilization declines? The tone of the story shifts slightly. Because up to this point, we've been looking at what was built, what was observed, what patterns may have been recognized. But now, we start to look at what remains and what doesn't. From a mainstream perspective, the loss of knowledge is a well-documented and natural part of history. Civilizations rise, expand, and eventually face challenges, environmental changes, resource depletion, internal conflict, external invasion. When those pressures reach a certain point, systems begin to break down. Trade networks collapse. Cities are abandoned. Institutions that once preserved and transmitted knowledge, schools, temples, administrative centers, can disappear or transform. And when that happens, knowledge doesn't always vanish completely, but it fragments. Some of it survives in written form, if those records endure. Some of it is passed down through oral traditions, though often altered over time, and some of it simply fades, especially if it was never formally recorded to begin with. This process is not mysterious, it's observable. We can trace it in multiple historical contexts. The decline of the Roman Empire, for example, led to a gradual loss of certain engineering practices in parts of Europe. Techniques for large-scale construction, road maintenance, and infrastructure became less consistent in the centuries that followed. Not because the knowledge was impossible to retain, but because the systems that supported it had changed. Over time, some of that knowledge was rediscovered, reinterpreted, or rebuilt in new forms. But the continuity was interrupted, and this pattern appears again and again. The collapse of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, saw multiple civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean experience rapid decline. Trade routes were disrupted. Writing systems disappeared in some regions for centuries. Entire cities were abandoned. The mainstream explanation points to a combination of factors: climate shifts, invasions, internal instability, rather than a single cause. But the result is clear: a loss of continuity. And when continuity is lost, something subtle happens to knowledge. It becomes harder to interpret. Because knowledge is not just information, it's context. It's understanding how pieces fit together. And when parts of that context are missing, the remaining pieces can become difficult to fully decode. This is particularly relevant when we look at ancient structures and symbols. We can measure them, analyze them, date them, but understanding their full purpose or meaning can be more challenging if the cultural framework that produced them is no longer intact. And this leads to an important distinction. There's a difference between lost knowledge and unrecognized knowledge. Lost knowledge is something that no longer exists in any recoverable form. Unrecognized knowledge, on the other hand, may still be present in artifacts, in patterns, in texts, but we don't yet fully understand what we're looking at. And in many cases, it's not immediately clear which is which. For example, when we examine ancient construction techniques that seem unusually precise, the mainstream approach is to explain them using known methods, tools, labor, incremental improvement, and in many cases, that works. But if there are aspects of those techniques that were not documented, or that relied on practices that didn't leave clear evidence, then part of that knowledge may remain unrecognized rather than truly lost. The same applies to symbolic systems. We may understand the general meaning of a symbol, but not the full depth of its significance within the original cultural context. Layers of meaning can exist: practical, philosophical, observational, and without the full framework, some of those layers may remain out of reach. But it's important to stay grounded here. The idea of lost knowledge can sometimes lead to exaggerated conclusions, assumptions of advanced technologies or hidden civilizations that are not supported by strong evidence. While it's natural to be curious about what we might not know, it's equally important to rely on what we can verify. And yet, acknowledging the limits of our current understanding is not the same as dismissing the unknown, because history is still being uncovered. New discoveries continue to reshape timelines, challenge assumptions, and add detail to what we thought we understood. Sites are uncovered that push back the dates of organized construction. Artifacts are found that reveal unexpected levels of craftsmanship. Analytical techniques improve, allowing us to extract more information from existing evidence. And each discovery adds another layer. Sometimes it confirms what we already believed. Sometimes it complicates it. And sometimes it opens entirely new questions. So perhaps the most accurate way to think about ancient knowledge is not as something that was simply lost or preserved, but as something that exists in different states. Some of it is well understood, some of it is partially understood, and some of it remains unclear. Not because it is intentionally hidden, but because the process of understanding is ongoing. As you reflect on this, there's a quiet shift in perspective. The ancient world becomes less like a closed chapter and more like a partially read book. Some pages are clear, others are faded, some are missing entirely. But the story continues to unfold as we turn each new page. And in that unfolding, there is a balance between certainty and curiosity, between evidence and interpretation, between what we know and what we are still trying to understand. And maybe that's what makes these ancient secrets so enduring. Not that they hold definitive answers, but that they invite continued exploration. They remind us that knowledge is not static. It evolves, it adapts, and sometimes it waits, waiting to be rediscovered, reinterpreted, or simply seen from a different angle. And as that idea settles in, it leads naturally to one final direction of thought. Because if knowledge can be lost, fragmented, or misunderstood, then how do we approach it today? How do we study the past in a way that is both careful and open, grounded, but curious? Because the way we ask questions shapes the answers we find. And when we arrive at that point, not just asking what ancient civilizations knew, but how we approach that knowledge today, the perspective shifts once again. Because now, the focus is no longer entirely on the past. It begins to include us, our methods, our assumptions, and the frameworks we use to interpret everything we've explored so far. From a mainstream perspective, the study of ancient history is built on careful, methodical processes. Archaeology relies on excavation, dating techniques, material analysis, and contextual comparison. Historians cross-reference texts, inscriptions, and artifacts to build timelines and narratives that are as consistent as possible with the available evidence. Science plays a central role. Carbon dating, satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, all tools designed to reduce uncertainty and increase accuracy. And this approach has been incredibly effective. It has allowed us to reconstruct entire civilizations, understand languages that were once unreadable, and piece together events that took place thousands of years ago. Without this structured methodology, much of what we know today would remain inaccessible. But like any system, it has its boundaries, because every method is based on certain assumptions. Not necessarily incorrect assumptions, but starting points. For example, the idea that technological development follows a generally linear progression, or that similar structures in different regions are more likely the result of independent development unless clear evidence of contact exists. These are reasonable positions, supported by a broad range of data, but they also shape how new information is interpreted. When an unusual artifact is discovered, or a site doesn't fit neatly into existing timelines, the initial response is often to try to integrate it into the current framework, to adjust the model slightly rather than replace it entirely. And most of the time, this works. The framework evolves, becoming more refined. But occasionally, there are findings that resist easy integration. Not because they overturn everything we know, but because they introduce complexity. They don't fit cleanly into established categories, and in those moments, interpretation becomes more challenging. This is where different approaches begin to diverge. Some researchers remain firmly within the established framework, focusing on explanations that align closely with existing evidence. Others explore alternative interpretations, asking whether the framework itself might need to expand in order to accommodate new data. And both approaches have value. One provides stability and consistency. The other encourages flexibility and exploration. The key is balance, because leaning too far in either direction can create problems. If we only accept what fits neatly into current models, we risk overlooking important anomalies. But if we accept every anomaly as evidence of something extraordinary, we risk losing the grounding that evidence provides. So the question becomes, how do we navigate that balance? Perhaps it begins with the way we ask questions. Instead of asking, "Is this proof of something hidden?" we might ask, "What are the possible explanations and which ones are supported by evidence?" Instead of assuming that gaps in knowledge must point to something dramatic, we can consider that they may simply reflect areas that require further study. And at the same time, we can remain open to the idea that our current understanding is not final, that new discoveries may challenge existing assumptions, that the past may be more complex than our models currently suggest. Because history is not static, it's a process of refinement. Each generation builds on the work of the previous one, adding detail, correcting errors, and sometimes rethinking entire sections of the narrative. And this process is ongoing. As technology improves, as new sites are discovered, as analytical methods become more precise, our ability to interpret the past continues to grow. What was once invisible becomes visible. What was once unclear becomes clearer. But there will always be limits. There will always be questions that cannot be fully answered, at least not yet. And maybe that's not a flaw in the process, but a feature of it. Because those unanswered questions are what drive exploration. They keep the field moving forward. They encourage curiosity, careful thinking, and a willingness to look again. As you reflect on everything we've explored, the structures, the patterns, the symbols, the cycles, the similarities between cultures, the fragmentation of knowledge, you begin to see a kind of thread running through it all. Not a single hidden truth, but a pattern of inquiry, a way of engaging with the unknown that is both cautious and curious. And perhaps that's the most important takeaway, that ancient secrets are not just about what is hidden in the past, but about how we choose to look for it. Because the lens we use shapes what we see. And if we approach the past with a mindset that is both grounded in evidence and open to complexity, we create space for deeper understanding. Not immediate answers, but better questions. And better questions, over time, tend to lead somewhere meaningful. As that idea settles in, there's a sense of quiet continuity. The same curiosity that guided ancient civilizations, the desire to observe, to understand, to find patterns, still exists today. It's expressed differently, through science, through research, through analysis. But at its core, it's the same impulse: to make sense of the world, to find structure within complexity, to explore what is known and what is not. And maybe that's the final connection between past and present. Not the monuments, not the symbols, but the questions themselves. Because those questions have never really disappeared. They've just changed form. And as long as they continue to be asked, the story remains unfinished. And as that realization settles in, that the questions themselves may be the most enduring connection between past and present. The pace of the exploration begins to soften slightly. Not because there is less to consider, but because the focus shifts from searching outward to observing more quietly. Because by now, a pattern has begun to emerge, not just in ancient structures or symbols, but in the way knowledge itself seems to move through time. It appears, it develops, it spreads, and then, sometimes, it fades or transforms. Not in a sudden, dramatic way, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a tide moving in and out. From a mainstream perspective, this is simply how cultures evolve. Ideas change as societies change. What is useful in one era may become less relevant in another. Technologies are replaced, belief systems adapt, and priorities shift. Over long periods, even foundational concepts can be reinterpreted or forgotten entirely. And this process is not inherently negative. It allows for growth, for adaptation, for new ways of thinking to emerge. But it also means that continuity is not guaranteed. Even important knowledge can become fragmented if the conditions that support it begin to change. And this brings us to a quieter, more subtle question. Not what ancient civilizations knew, but how they preserved what they knew. Because preservation is not automatic. It requires intention. Written language is one method, of course. Inscriptions, manuscripts, records. These allow information to be stored and transmitted with a certain level of consistency. But writing has its limits. It can be lost, destroyed, or become unreadable as languages evolve. Oral traditions are another method. Stories passed down through generations can preserve knowledge in a more flexible form. They can adapt, change, and remain relevant within different contexts. But they are also more susceptible to variation. Details shift, meanings evolve. And then there is a third method, one that is less direct, but perhaps more enduring. Embedding knowledge into physical space. When a structure is built with specific proportions, orientations, or alignments, it becomes more than just a building. It becomes a kind of record, not in the form of words, but in the form of relationships between angles, positions, and timing. From a mainstream perspective, this is often understood as symbolic or ceremonial design. Structures reflect cultural beliefs, astronomical observations, or social organization, and this interpretation is well supported. But there's another way to look at it, not as an alternative, but as an extension. If knowledge is embedded into physical forms, into architecture, into layout, into alignment, then it becomes less dependent on language. It doesn't need to be translated. It doesn't rely on a specific script or vocabulary. It simply exists. And as long as the structure remains, the pattern remains. Of course, interpreting that pattern still requires context. Without understanding the original framework, the meaning may not be immediately clear. But the information itself, the relationships, the alignments, can persist. And this raises an interesting possibility, that some forms of ancient knowledge were designed to be resilient. Not in the sense of being hidden, but in the sense of being stable, less likely to degrade over time because they are not stored in fragile mediums. Stone, after all, lasts. But even stone is not permanent. Erosion, earthquakes, human activity, over long enough periods, everything changes. Structures collapse, surfaces wear down, entire sites can be buried or repurposed. So even this method of preservation has limits. And yet, fragments remain, enough to suggest that there was intention behind how things were built. Enough to indicate that certain patterns were considered important enough to encode into the physical world. And that brings us back to a familiar space. A space between what we can confirm and what we are still trying to understand. Because when we encounter these fragments, structures aligned with celestial events, symbols repeated across cultures, systems that reflect complex observations, we are not just looking at isolated pieces. We are looking at the remains of systems that were once whole. And reconstructing those systems is not straightforward. It requires careful analysis, yes, but it also requires a willingness to consider multiple layers at once: practical, symbolic, observational, cultural, all interacting in ways that may not always be easy to separate. Some researchers approach this by focusing strictly on what can be measured and verified. Others allow for broader interpretation, exploring how different elements might connect. And again, balance becomes important, because too narrow a focus can miss the larger pattern, but too broad an interpretation can lose clarity. So perhaps the most effective approach is one that moves slowly, that examines each piece carefully, but also steps back from time to time, allowing patterns to emerge naturally rather than forcing them. And as you sit with that idea, there's a kind of quiet shift. The need for definitive answers begins to fade slightly, replaced by something more steady. A sense of observation, of patience. Because understanding the past is not a single moment of discovery. It's a process, layer by layer, question by question. And sometimes, the most meaningful insights are not the ones that arrive suddenly, but the ones that build gradually, almost without notice, like recognizing a pattern that was always there, but only becomes visible when you stop looking for it directly. And maybe that's where these ancient secrets truly exist, not hidden behind locked doors or buried beneath the earth, but resting in the patterns themselves, waiting to be noticed. Not all at once, but slowly. And as that thought settles in, it opens one final direction to explore. Because if knowledge can be embedded, fragmented, and rediscovered, then what does that mean for the future? How will the knowledge we create today be understood thousands of years from now? And what patterns are we leaving behind? And when that question begins to take shape, not about the distant past, but about the distant future, something subtle shifts in the way we see everything that came before. Because now, the ancient world is no longer just something we are trying to understand. It becomes something we can relate to in a different way, because one day, we will be the past. From a mainstream perspective, this is not a mysterious idea. Every civilization, no matter how advanced or complex, eventually becomes part of history. The systems we rely on, the knowledge we develop, the structures we build, all of it will, over time, be interpreted by future generations through whatever frameworks they have available. And just like us, they will have gaps. They will have fragments of information, some preserved clearly, others distorted or incomplete. They will analyze what remains, build models to explain it, and try to piece together a coherent narrative from whatever evidence has survived. And in doing so, they may encounter the same kinds of challenges we face today. Because not all knowledge preserves equally. Digital information, for example, is incredibly dense and efficient, but also fragile in its own way. It depends on systems, formats, and technologies that may not remain accessible over long periods. Without the tools to decode it, vast amounts of data could become unreadable, even if it physically still exists. Written records may last longer, but they too are subject to loss, decay, and reinterpretation. Languages evolve, meanings shift, context can disappear, leaving behind words that are technically preserved, but not fully understood. And physical structures, while often more durable, are not immune either. Cities change, materials degrade, land shifts. Over centuries or millennia, even the most solid constructions can be altered or erased. So when future generations look back at us, they may not see a complete picture. They may see fragments, patterns, inconsistencies. And they will begin asking questions. How did this civilization function? What did they understand? Why did they build certain things in certain ways? What did their symbols mean? And perhaps most interesting of all, what did they choose to preserve? Because preservation is not just about durability, it's about intention. What we record, what we build, what we emphasize, these choices shape how we will be understood. And in that sense, we are not so different from the ancient civilizations we've been exploring. They built structures that lasted. They encoded meaning into symbols, into alignment, into space. They created systems that reflected their understanding of the world, knowing, or perhaps simply accepting, that not all of it would remain intact. And now, we are interpreting those remnants, carefully, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. And the same will likely be true in reverse. Future observers may look at our world and see patterns we didn't intend. They may misinterpret certain elements or overlook others entirely. They may assume connections where none existed, or miss connections that were obvious to us. And that's not a failure. It's part of the process. Because understanding across time is never perfect. It's always an approximation, an attempt to reconstruct meaning from incomplete information. But within that imperfection, there is something consistent. The desire to understand. The impulse to look at what remains and ask, what does this tell us? And that impulse connects us to the past in a very direct way. Because it's the same impulse that led ancient civilizations to observe the sky, to track cycles, to build structures aligned with patterns they considered meaningful. It's the same curiosity, expressed through different tools. And perhaps that's one of the most grounding realizations in all of this, that despite the differences in technology, language, and culture, the underlying drive to explore, to question, to find patterns remains unchanged. So when we look at ancient secrets, we're not just looking at something distant or unfamiliar. We're looking at an earlier version of the same process we're engaged in now, trying to understand the world, trying to find structure within complexity, trying to leave something behind that will make sense, even when we are no longer here to explain it. And maybe that's where everything begins to come together, not in a single answer or a hidden revelation, but in a kind of continuity, a thread that runs through time, connecting past, present, and future, not through specific knowledge, but through the act of seeking it. Because knowledge changes, frameworks evolve, but the act of asking questions, of observing carefully, of remaining open to what we don't yet understand, that remains. And as that idea settles in, it creates a sense of quiet perspective. The ancient world becomes less mysterious in one sense, and more meaningful in another. Not because all its secrets are solved, but because we begin to see how those secrets fit into a larger pattern, a pattern that includes us. And as that pattern continues to unfold, there is one final layer to explore, not about what ancient civilizations built, not about what they knew, but about what all of this might mean when taken together. And as we move into that final layer, something begins to settle. Not in the sense of reaching a conclusion, but in the sense of stepping back far enough to see the whole pattern at once. Because up to this point, we've explored the pieces, the structures, the alignments, the symbols, the cycles, the preservation of knowledge, and the way it fragments over time. But now, the question becomes quieter and perhaps deeper. What does all of it mean when viewed together? From a mainstream perspective, the answer remains grounded. Ancient civilizations were complex, intelligent, and adaptive. They observed the world carefully, developed systems to navigate it and express their understanding through architecture, symbolism, and cultural practices. Over time, those systems evolved, sometimes disappeared, and were replaced by new ones. What we see today is the result of that long, continuous process. And in many ways, that explanation is enough. It accounts for the evidence. It aligns with what we can verify. It provides a stable framework for understanding the past without requiring assumptions that go beyond what can be supported. But when you sit with everything we've explored, there's a subtle sense that something else is present. Not something hidden in a dramatic way, but something that emerges when you look at the patterns as a whole. Because across different civilizations, across different time periods, there is a recurring tendency to observe, to align, to encode, to preserve, and to repeat, not perfectly, not identically, but consistently enough that it begins to feel intentional at a broader level, not necessarily coordinated between cultures, but reflective of a shared way of engaging with the world. And that shared approach seems to revolve around patterns. Patterns in the sky, patterns in time, patterns in structure, patterns in meaning. From a grounded point of view, this makes sense. Humans are pattern-seeking by nature. Recognizing patterns helps us survive, predict, and organize information. It allows us to create systems, to find order in complexity. But when that pattern-seeking behavior is extended across generations, when it becomes embedded into culture, into architecture, into systems of belief, it starts to take on a different quality. It becomes a kind of continuity, not just of knowledge, but of perspective. And maybe that's what we've been circling around this entire time. Not a single lost secret, not a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered, but a consistent way of looking at the world, one that appears again and again in different forms, a way of paying attention, of noticing cycles, of trying to align human activity with something larger, more stable, more predictable. And whether that something larger was understood as natural law, cosmic order, or symbolic meaning, the approach remains similar. Observe carefully, look for repetition, build in alignment with what you observe, and preserve that understanding in a way that can outlast a single lifetime. When you think about it that way, the ancient world feels less distant, because we are still doing the same thing. Through science, we observe patterns in nature. Through technology, we build systems that rely on those patterns. Through data, we attempt to preserve and transmit knowledge. The tools are different, the scale is different, but the underlying process is familiar. And that realization doesn't diminish the mystery. If anything, it reframes it. Because instead of asking, what did they know that we don't? We might begin to ask, what were they paying attention to? And how does that compare to what we focus on today? And that question doesn't lead to a single answer. It leads to reflection. Because attention shapes understanding. What a civilization chooses to observe, measure, and preserve determines what it becomes skilled at recognizing. Ancient civilizations, in many cases, were deeply attuned to long-term cycles, astronomical, seasonal, environmental. Their systems reflect that focus. Modern civilization, on the other hand, tends to focus on precision, speed, and short-term measurement. We track time down to fractions of a second. We process information rapidly. We optimize. Both approaches have value. But they emphasize different aspects of reality. And when you place them side by side, it creates an interesting contrast. Not a contradiction, but a difference in perspective. And perhaps that difference is where some of the lingering sense of mystery comes from. Not because ancient knowledge is beyond our reach, but because it may be oriented differently, focused on patterns that unfold slowly, on relationships that are not immediately obvious. on systems that require patience to fully perceive. And in a world that moves quickly, those kinds of patterns can be easy to overlook. So maybe the final insight here is not about uncovering something hidden, but about adjusting how we look, slowing down, observing more carefully, allowing patterns to emerge over time rather than expecting immediate clarity. Because the ancient world, in many ways, rewards that kind of attention, not by revealing all its secrets at once, but by gradually becoming more understandable the longer you sit with it. And as that idea settles in, there's a sense of quiet completion, not because every question has been answered, but because the exploration itself has reached a kind of balance between knowing and not knowing, between explanation and curiosity. And from that place, one final thought begins to form, not about the past, not about the future, but about the space in between, the present moment, where all of this is being considered, and what we choose to do with it. And as we arrive in that space, the present moment, there's a subtle shift that's easy to overlook. Because throughout this entire exploration, we've been moving across time, looking back at ancient civilizations, forward toward the future, and now gently returning to where we are right now. And in doing so, something becomes clear in a quiet, almost understated way. The present is not separate from the past. It is shaped by it. From a mainstream perspective, this is simply how continuity works. Every system we rely on, our calendars, our measurements, our architecture, even the way we organize knowledge, has roots that extend backward. Not always directly, not always in a straight line, but through layers of development, adaptation, and refinement. We didn't arrive here all at once. We arrived here gradually, and the same is true for understanding, because the way we interpret the ancient world is influenced by the tools and frameworks we have today. Our technologies allow us to measure more precisely, to analyze more deeply, to uncover details that were previously invisible. But those same tools also shape what we prioritize, what we notice, and what we consider important. So when we look at ancient structures, we might focus on engineering. When we examine symbols, we might focus on meaning. When we study timekeeping, we might focus on accuracy. All of these perspectives are valid, but they are still perspectives. And that means there is always the possibility that something lies just outside of them, not hidden, but simply not emphasized. And this is where the present moment becomes more than just a point in time. It becomes a point of awareness. Because right now, as you sit and reflect on everything we've explored, you are doing something that connects directly to the ancient world. You are observing. You are noticing patterns. You are asking questions. And that process, that quiet act of attention, is the same process that underlies everything we've discussed. It's what led ancient civilizations to track the stars, to align structures, to create systems that reflected their understanding of the world. Not because they had all the answers, but because they were paying attention. And that may be one of the simplest, but most meaningful connections of all. Because knowledge does not begin with answers. It begins with observation, with curiosity, with the willingness to sit with something long enough for patterns to emerge. And in a world that often moves quickly, where information is constant and immediate, that kind of attention can feel rare. But it's still there, available, quiet, unhurried. And when you allow yourself to engage with it, even briefly, you begin to notice something interesting. The need for certainty starts to soften. The pressure to find a definitive answer begins to fade. And in its place, there's a different kind of clarity. Not the clarity of conclusion, but the clarity of perspective. Because instead of asking, what is the final answer? You begin to ask, what can I observe? What can I understand right now with the information available? And that shift changes everything. It transforms ancient secrets from something distant and mysterious into something that is part of an ongoing process. A process that includes you. Because the act of exploring, of questioning, of thinking carefully about what is known and what is not limited to historians or researchers. It's something anyone can engage in. And in doing so, you become part of the same continuity we've been tracing, not as an observer of history, but as a participant in understanding it. And maybe that's where everything gently comes together. Not in uncovering a hidden truth, not in solving a final mystery, but in recognizing that the process itself, the act of looking, of thinking, of remaining open, is what connects all of these pieces across time. The ancient world observed patterns. We observe patterns. The tools change, the frameworks evolve, but the underlying process remains. And as that realization settles in, there's a sense of stillness, not empty, but complete in a different way. Because the exploration doesn't end here. It simply pauses, leaving space for reflection, for new questions, for the possibility that understanding is not something we arrive at once, but something we move through gradually. And as you sit with that thought, there's one final piece to consider, not about what has been discovered, but about how it all feels. Because sometimes the most lasting insights are not the ones that explain everything, but the ones that quietly change how you see things, without needing to. And as we arrive at this final part, there's no sudden revelation waiting, no hidden answer being uncovered at the last moment. Instead, there's something quieter, something more in line with everything that has come before. A kind of gentle settling of ideas, where the exploration doesn't end with certainty, but with perspective. Because when you look back across everything we've moved through, the structures, the alignments, the patterns in time, the shared symbols across distant cultures, the rise and fragmentation of knowledge, and even the way we interpret it all today, there is no single thread that explains everything. But there is a rhythm in how humans engage with the unknown. From a mainstream perspective, that rhythm is simply part of being human. We observe, we experiment, we build models, and we refine them over time. When new information appears, we adjust. When gaps remain, we continue searching. It's a process that is both practical and necessary, and it has allowed us to understand the world in increasingly detailed ways. And yet, when you step back, that process itself begins to resemble the very patterns we've been exploring. Cycles of discovery, cycles of forgetting, cycles of rediscovery. Not in a perfect loop, but in a kind of gradual unfolding motion, like layers building on top of each other, each one shaped by what came before. Ancient civilizations observed the world around them and tried to align with it. We do the same, but in different ways. They built structures to reflect patterns they considered meaningful. We build systems, scientific, technological, informational, that reflect patterns we have identified. They preserved knowledge in stone, in symbols, in stories. We preserve knowledge in data, in networks, in digital archives. And just like them, we face the same underlying limitation. We don't see everything. We interpret what we can, based on the tools and perspectives available to us. And that means there will always be edges to our understanding, places where the picture is incomplete, not because something is being hidden, but because the process is still ongoing. And maybe that's the most grounded way to think about ancient secrets, not as mysteries waiting to be solved once and for all, but as parts of a much larger process, one that doesn't really have a final endpoint, because every answer leads to new questions, every discovery reveals new layers, and every attempt to understand the past also tells us something about the present, about how we think, what we prioritize, what we notice, and what we might overlook. So instead of asking, "What is the secret?" we might begin to ask something slightly different. What is the pattern? And when you ask that question, not quickly, but patiently, you begin to see that the pattern is not confined to any one place or time. It appears in how civilizations rise and adapt, in how knowledge is built, fragmented, and rebuilt again, in how humans continuously try to align themselves with something larger, whether that is nature, time, or meaning itself. And that pattern doesn't belong only to the past. It's still happening, right now, in ways that may not be immediately obvious, but are no less real. And as that idea settles in, there's a sense that the need for a final answer begins to fade. Not because the questions aren't important, but because the value was never only in answering them. It was in following them, carefully, thoughtfully, without rushing, allowing each idea to lead naturally into the next. Because that process, that slow unfolding of understanding, is what connects everything we've explored. It's what connects ancient builders observing the sky, to modern researchers analyzing data, to you, right now, sitting with these thoughts. And maybe that's where this ends. Not with a conclusion, but with a kind of quiet awareness that the world, past and present, is full of patterns, some obvious, some subtle, some understood, and some still waiting to be noticed. And the more patiently we observe them, the more they begin to reveal not necessarily answers, but a deeper sense of connection between ideas, between time periods, between different ways of seeing the same reality. So as this comes to a close, there's nothing left to solve, only something to carry forward, a way of looking, a way of thinking, a willingness to remain curious, without needing everything to be resolved. Because in the end, that might be the most enduring secret of all. Not something hidden in the past, but something quietly present in the way we choose to see